she said she was going. We'll start in just a minute so everyone can have a chance to get some food and seconds and thirds and eat all the pizza. Welcome, everyone. Tonight is our meeting, our City Council meeting with the Historical and Landmarks Commission. So we're pleased to have you here and honored to have you here with us this evening. I'd like to go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves. When you press the button and it turns green, then it's working. So if you could all speak in the microphone, that'll be helpful for the people that are watching us at home. So I'm Lisa Gilmore, Mayor, and welcome this evening for this meeting. We've been looking forward to this. I'll start here on my right with Councilmember O'Neill.
Teresa O'Neill.
Karen Hardy, former HLC member.
Patricia Mahan, also a former HLC member.
Oh.
Probably before Anna was born, but also vice mayor.
Deanna Santana, City Manager.
Alexander Abbey, Assistant City Attorney.
Michael Salso, HLC Commissioner.
Patricia Long, HLC.
Stephen Estes, HLC.
Priya Crew Chair, HLC.
Anna Vargas Smith, HLC.
Yen Chen, Staff Liaison to the Landmarks Commission.
Andrew Crabtree, Director of Community Development.
Rod Child, Council Member.
Kathy Watanabe.
Debbie Davis, council member.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And I know Spike Standifer is getting some pizza. I saw him. Here he comes, and he'll be joining us as well. This is going to be an informational meeting. We're anxious to hear your work plan and progress, what you've done and what's going on with the HLC. We'd also like to make it more casual, so my council members and commission members, if you'd like to just jump in at any time so we can have a real meaningful dialogue. So I know, Priya, you have something prepared if you'd like to proceed so we can get started.
This is a work in progress. We're always a work in progress here, but I wanted to bring forward some of our thoughts and in how to present information shared between the council, but also as a public document. So what you have in front of you is a work plan or an action plan that we have collaboratively worked on and brought forward some ideas, and then behind is accomplishment. So moving forward, this would be a strategy to have a quick, snapshot of what were your year's goals and what was your accomplishment. So moving forward, we can actually have metrics and measurements. So I just wanted to first start off by thanking both City Council and members of my commission and staff. It's been an incredibly supportive and encouraging, enabling environment from a commission standpoint. We have seen, especially with the adoption of the Historic Preservation Ordinance, a more streamlined and, easy to let the members of community and public know, some of our guidelines, framework. Prior to that, we had all our stumbling blocks, and it's kind of streamlined now. So thank you for adopting that again. So that has been a very big milestone for our HLC. And staff has also worked, very progressively, proactively in looking at our Mills Act contracts. They've done extensive, inventory, reconnaissance surveys. Thanks for all that information. It has been a very, very time-intensive effort. And then from the City Council, we have had a lot of feedback from members of community about how you've brought back to HLC some of the projects that I otherwise would not have come, if not for your referral. Because we have limitations in our historic preservation ordinance, how far. But because of some of your support, take it back to HLC and give us your recommendations has brought a little more, enabling and communication between members of public, the commission, and City Council. So we see ourselves as enabling what City Council would like for us to do. Again, what you have is just a snapshot you can review at leisure. But I wanted to also highlight some of our areas for improvement, and that's where I want to take the dialogue moving forward. We've done incredible strides, in getting our preservation ordinance, so what's next? A couple of meetings we've had concerns from members of public about communication, noticing, especially when it comes to very sensitive topics like Mills Act contracts, which is a contract by the city, and as we go through some of our procedures or policies related to how do we audit these or how do we report this to the state, because it is a luxury. We are giving tax benefit dollars. So if they're not maintained or if they're not still adhering to contractual obligations, what should be our process? It's not we got you moment. It's how to make them become compliant, because in the end, it's still a city resource. We want to ideally bring the landowner into our fold and allow him to preserve the resource. So it has been sometimes a contentious topic. So one thing that we are looking moving forward is to enable more workshop on Mills Act contracts. What is the contractual obligation? What would be the carrot? What is the real carrot? How much do they see as an incentive? And what is the stick? So what would be, when is the decision-making point when we say this is not in compliance with Mills Act contract anymore? Of course, when the resource is no longer there, it's an absolute given. But there's been a death by 1,000 cuts that we have not been able to capture.
Can I ask you something about that, Priya, with the Mills Act contract? So as you mentioned, the contract is a benefit for the homeowner, and the city only allows so many Mills Act contracts per year. First of all, are we at the limit per year, or how have the applications been coming in?
The last couple of years, we've been averaging around 4 to 5. There was a little bit low. Early on in the process, we were hitting the limits. Originally, council set it to 5, and then they raised it to 10 per year.
Right.
And so we haven't reached 10 over the last 5 to 6 years. We've always been around 5 to 6.
Okay, so when they submit these contracts, they put a list of improvements that they're going to do to their properties.
Right.
And they have to do those improvements over, is it a 10-year period? Over a 10-year period. So what you're saying is, are we not enforcing those contracts? Are we managing those contracts? I know that we finally have a contract manager in the city, but I don't know if the contract manager is in charge of the Mills Act. Probably not at this point. So who is looking at the Mills Act contracts?
So it's been almost, staff can chime in, commission members. It's been a it's more by the landowners. goodwill that
Okay,
we
I think you answered my question then. Thank you.
Let- So let me add on to that. We did complete a comprehensive audit of all the Mills Act properties.
That was a couple of years ago?
Last fall.
Was it last-
End of
last
summer,
year?
fall, we
Okay.
completed it. That was the first time that we had done it, though. And so then I think part of what you're alluding to is that if we did identify in that audit properties of noncompliance, one of the questions, then what is the next step?
Yes.
Yes.
So if I may, one
Yes.
thing we've observed looking at prior Mills Act contracts, and we saw rather a number when the audit happened. As we look deeper in the past, the addendum to the contract is a formal pro forma document with an addendum of the 10-year plan. And sometimes that addendum is very loosely phrased, 5 bullet points, 15 bullet points. It's not contractual language. It's not 3 from column A, 2 from column B. And we know that a 10-year project, if you will, is going to have uncertainties emerge. So one thing I think would be good is to make sure when we get these phrased, they're phrased in such a way that a tiny variation doesn't amount to a substantial variation when they say, I was going to replace the retaining wall, but I wound up replacing the foundation under the porch. That should be something that we can balance dynamically without necessarily calling them into the HLC.
So they get a tremendous amount of tax break for these projects, property taxes. So there should, I don't know in the audit, was there compliance for the most part, or should we be tightening up the Mills Act? You know, although leaving some flexibility for things as they change, as we know projects change, you know, during time.
Yes.
Yeah, we found that for most of the property owners, we're in compliance. There was originally 11 that had gone to the Historical Landmarks Commission last year for some additional review and some concerns about the contractual terms, and there were some recommendations on that, and staff has continued to work through those property owners to try to bring them up into conformance. There are ones that are definitely either no-show or out of compliance, and those we would have to work with our attorney's office. And they're contracts, so they have to basically meet the terms of the contract and possibly come before the council for some actions.
And the city does have the power to revoke the contracts after a hearing. If the city revokes a contract, there's a penalty of 12.5% of the then current property value, which can obviously be very significant in this market.
Wow.
It's huge, and that's what we heard from the 11 members.
In the 10-year period, I assume they never come back to the HLC for any sort of update or anything like that?
That would be a good,
Might be something to
that would
look
be a
at.
good catch, because if they are coming in for an approval or a permit process, it's an instant, you are bringing it up for visual visibility and inspection.
I'm sorry, Councilmember Mahan,
Yeah,
I'm
'cause
Vice Mayor, would you like to say something?
These contracts are actually a 3-part contract. The county is the third party to these contracts. What oversight do they give?
The county is, as far as I know, from what experience I had, they do the taxation, so that's their role. They're not actually, they from the state, which passed its act to allow for a 5-year inspection times, it's built now into the state law. They are able to actually go out and do independent inspections and verifications, because they are also doing, but I don't know, are they signatory in the Mills Act contract?
No, they're not.
So it's between the city and the landlord. So the
County has to
county is only a
approve it.
third-party verification from a taxation.
Right, they have to approve it.
So,
Lose the taxes too. But how flexible are these? Because we all know these are old homes, they're historic homes, and often you don't know when you buy them,
yeah.
going into them, what you're going to find.
Right.
So, and the money that you save from taxes, you have to promise that you're going to use to rehab the house. But, so how flexible are they when you say, oh yeah, we're going to put in a retaining wall, but you end up saying, oh no, the retaining wall is not necessary, but hey, your porch foundation is crumbling. So you switch it out and you spend the money on rehab projects. So how flexible are these?
If I may, given the size of the penalty, I think, to summarize, when we do a new Mills Act contract, we should look at that 10-year plan and make sure that it's phrased in a way that staff and city attorneys can look at and say, there is flexibility in the plan, and what they're doing is within the scope and the variability in the plan, rather than having a very rigid, we will do A and B and C and D and E. We never did D, we're in violation. Really? We did F, which wasn't on the plan, right? So I think we need to phrase those in a way that doesn't lead to the kind of uncertainty we heard, a few months back here.
Yeah.
And I think even catching the ones that aren't doing anything at all. There has
Yeah,
to
if
be
they're not doing
some,
anything.
there has to be some, maybe midterm check-in or something like that. I would propose that that your commission take a look at that, if we can add in anything like that, just to catch the ones because of potential abuse. I don't know how many came up, and was there a certain percentage that came up?
But yeah.
Yeah. Councilmember Hardy?
I was
So,
just
so
go
we
ahead,
have
Steph.
two that were actively, that are on our list as being completely non-compliant. And it's really just a question of staff resources of when we can work with the attorney's office in terms of next steps on those two.
Yeah, the remaining folks, they're in compliance with certain aspects of the contract, whether the property is in good maintenance from the street presentation, but they're lacking with regards to the individual items on the 10-year plan, or there's cost items. They got some evaluation on a foundation, and yet it was too costly, but they did other work other than a foundation.
can
There's
see
all
all
those
that.
type of examples. And so we have to work through those. And the original 11, there was, again, clarification as far as how much information do we have to bring to the attorney's office, and staff has continued to work with them. Out of the 11 original, we already cleared about six of them, so the list is dwindling down.
Are you talking 2 out of 11 that did nothing?
That's correct.
Okay. Well, it gives you a percentage of what we're looking at. I mean, the goal is to get them to do work on the homes and restore the homes. I mean, that's the whole goal of the Mills Act.
Right.
Okay. Well, Councilmember Hardy, did you have
Well, I was
something
just
else?
going to say, it was one of my goals when I was chair that we had a limit of only 5, and that was my goal, to get it up to 10, so that we could encourage this. I like the idea of a 5-year plan, 5-year checkup. Now, when we talk about the 10-year plan, it's actually a perpetual. The idea is supposed to be perpetual, that you take something off the top and everything gets bumped up and you add something new down the road. And as Patty said, you never know what's going to break next. Yeah. And things take a little bit longer, but the idea was to do that. Also, we didn't have anyone on staff that was had a historic preservation background, and that was the other big goal I had for that 1 year as chair, to make certain that we saw that as a priority.
Right.
Because we hadn't done a lot of the follow-up. We didn't have a listing. There were some things that needed to have happen. So I'm just excited that some of the things I pushed for back in the 90s are still going. And but I like the idea of maybe the commission doing the 5-year follow-up. If you know that you're going to have a follow-up and need to defend that, what you're doing, and there are substantial penalties, there's reasons for everyone to keep to our agreement.
Right.
Could we have direction? Let's assume that we start inviting people at a 5-year point to come to the HLC. Was that what you would incline to, or would it be a staff visit? Which of the two?
I would suggest putting it in the original Mills Act contract so that it's enforceable.
Codified.
Put it on,
Right.
it's codified, put it in writing, and maybe sending out something to those that have, if they want to come in on a voluntary basis, since they didn't agree to
My
it.
question is more operational, and that is, should the HLC be reviewing it, or should it be
Yes,
at the staff?
I would
And then if
say-
the HLC does review it, do we charge them for that? Do we recover cost for that, or is it part of the built-in?
I know, this is red, this is green. Of having it come to HLC is because then it becomes part of your minutes, and then the council will be aware of it. Yeah.
Just to provide a little more background, we had 144 properties that we surveyed, and we determined, so of those, only 11 that weren't close enough or in compliance, basically, that we brought forward 11. And in some of those, there's circumstances, as we've discussed, that's, they didn't do what they were supposed to do in year 3, but they maybe did something from year 7 or that kind of issue. So I think generally, our experience was in interacting with these individuals that, people who are participating are definitely enthusiastic about preserving their residence and taking advantage of the program. So we don't see, I wouldn't characterize it as abuse, just 1 or 2 properties where, maybe there was a property transaction, something fell through the cracks or circumstances changed in a way that they weren't able to follow through.
And that's absolutely correct, because most of the owners who came forward were significantly responsive and wanted to preserve. There's just life circumstances takes over, and that's why the penalty was a huge shocker to them. It was one way to bring them forward, because I don't know if our
I think we just want to know that there's contract oversight.
Right.
And we want to feel comfortable that there is contract because of the tax break on it. I want to make sure we're doing everything the right way.
Yeah, I mean, for the Historical Landmarks Commission, they heard this message very clearly from the council members of years past. And just a couple years ago, they created an ad hoc committee to basically gather their information. Before they were all paper copy contracts, and we were able to create spreadsheets, catalog the parcel numbers, property owners, and it really helped us after the ad hoc committee was created to use this list as part of our audit. The attorney's office has assisted us too. When the state law was changed a number of years ago, they noted that we needed to incorporate a 5-year audit. And so it was about 6-7 years ago. And so we started the formal audit process within that 5-year period. And then we have to work on a continuous basis, either rolling or every 5 years to do more of a comprehensive audit. The HLC members have also noted that our historical inventory list needs to be more robust and categorize which ones are the ones that have contracts, the best of the best, you might say, differentiate the National Register properties from California to our local, and then which ones we enter into contracts. And we're getting close. We have the spreadsheets and database, and we're going to start working on getting that more visibility on our city's website.
Very good. Thank you.
So then just a minor comment in answer to Steve's question. So if we have 144 properties, obviously you're not going to have 144 homeowners coming to your HLC meetings. So those, if you just get a staff report, and then that report would go into your minutes and we would get that information. But those that you're having problems with, that you want to face-to-face, I think should then go to HLC.
back to HLC.
And then we would get a report that way too.
And just put in any future contract.
Oh, yeah, I think staff already said they're going to do that.
Okay.
So a couple more, and I'm hoping that other commission members have a chance to give their.
You're doing such a good job.
A key point is it ties very closely with our zoning ordinance updates. Some of the areas where the linkage is still not connected fully well with the historic preservation ordinance, and that was again from a public meeting that we had, Park Court being an example, where previous era or previous way of doing permitting was, the assumption was that it is a historic, almost like a district, that everybody within Park Court would come and would be under a same standard guidelines. I don't know if it was codified, but apparently it was enforced that way. But with the new historic preservation ordinance, they felt that it was taken away, and they were no longer considered that, one blanket. If you're in Park Court, you have these design guidelines or standards that you would have to meet. So it became, at least and we've continued this item actually because we didn't have sufficient time to review the actual the project. But it seemed like the property owner did not know, because the 200 feet between property did not require him. But historically, the Park Court has always been under this guidance and guidelines and standards enforced. So the actual neighborhood came up very vocally stating that they would like, and the owner was also saying, I would have loved to if I had known. So there seems to be this growing desire for, we want to be a historic district or we want to be an overlay. What do we do to enable those? Because our historic preservation ordinance, unless we tell each member, like, every 200 feet properties, if you're in Mills Act, yes, you're going to be there, but seems like there's some disconnect between our historic preservation ordinance intent and what some of our historic districts, or, it could be Old Quad or some of the other more sensitive areas. What would be a good bridge to allow for this overlay or a design guideline neighborhood district? You could call it a neighborhood district, you could call it a design historic overlay district. So those are some of the things that we'd like to see in a zoning ordinance that would, recap or reiterate some of the goals from the community, because they want to be. This is, for most of our part, we'd say, how do we preserve property rights and property owners' rights? But this is a neighborhood that wants to be in that district. So that's one area we would like for you to consider.
You want to say something on that?
Yeah, my curiosity. Okay, so
Green.
I'm sorry, green, not red. So my thinking is, because we have this ADU thing, and I look at a historical district, and somebody decides they want to put an ADU in their backyard, is that going to take away from what we have? I mean, those kind of things bother me. And then there's other things that are happening in the city right now, not just in the historic district, is people are buying houses and then turning them into Airbnbs, which I think is affecting a few people, what I heard in the cloud out there. So I'm just wondering, when you're talking about quantifying a historic preservation contract, do we look at eliminating the ADU, or like what language do we put in there to make it historical? And so where do we go? And like you said, what is that bridge? How do we do that? And because you can't take away somebody's property rights.
Right.
And that's going to be the thing that they're going to come firing at you. So that's, we're treading on some thin ice right now. So I don't know how to address that, but what I see now is like some neighborhoods want to be preserved the way they are, and how do we do that within the city?
Right.
And it's not just historical, it's got to be everybody. So when we look at the zoning ordinance, it's got to be one for all and all for one kind of a thing. So I understand your concerns, because I hear people out there that are already having problems with that.
Yeah.
So I don't know, go ahead.
Currently, the preservation ordinance allows review of historical resources. And so within this last year, the Landmarks Commission had looked at, I think it was 2 projects that had ADUs on historical resources. They understood the intent of the state law is if you basically meet the general guidance of creating housing and within the setbacks, that they should give some clearance, that not to hold it on the ADU, but really focus on the design, try to make it more compatible and complementary to the historical resource itself. Try to shift it so that it's not on the primary view, that you're blocking corridors and such. But as the commission noted, that message needs to get out to the community, those that are within the areas where there's more historical resources. And then sensitivity training, you might say, for the rest of the city. Are you doing harm to your own neighborhood by just strictly following the ADU? Here's 14 points, and that's all I'm looking at, versus saying, I belong to a neighborhood, I should have some design criteria to make it more compatible and complementary. Obviously, we want to make it a discretionary, not a discretionary for the ADU on most of the areas, and it's just basically a ministerial action at this point. And there is some feedback from the community that there are some concern about that.
Right.
Priya, can I ask you something when you talk about, let's say, Park Court, for example, and that's a very unique area of the city. There's really nothing like that anywhere else. The lot sizes, the configuration, everything about it. Are you saying that that neighborhood, for instance, would like their own overlay just for that neighborhood for design purposes? And then we have looking at other neighborhoods in this, the Old Quad, and everyone has their own idea of what the boundaries of the Old Quad are and what it actually means. But is that the kind of thing you're talking about, taking the unique areas of town and creating some sort of a overlay or district?
Correct.
I just want to make sure I understand
Yes. So
what you're talking about.
it's been done in other jurisdictions. So it enables the base zoning ordinance always becomes the baseline, okay, setbacks, but it allows this overlay to give them either additional protection, or it does release some of the other setback limitations that you would normally have in a regular residential neighborhood. It would relieve that. It would give, but it's based on a survey. It has to have some professional validation of the meets and bounds. What's the geographic boundary? What is really historic? What are the contributing resources? So one way to address, even as a city, would be to do a historic context statement. We've documented City of Santa Clara's history, but if you go a little more not granular, but a little more in depth, you'd be able to identify those zones that have these remnants or true historic district, because a district is formed by multiple units, and then what would be the appropriate guidelines? What has been the contributing features that you could actually impose, as now new design would have batten of this size or with a variable. There's always a flexibility you can because no historic resource is expected to duplicate itself. So you can always give that overlay with contemporary, but contemporary that's actually compatible with the district. So it gives you a little more framework that the residential and homeowners have now bought into, but also know and understand clearly. So it's not subjective, so subjective that they don't know what is right or wrong.
Patty, yeah,
So
just jump in, guys.
Park Court's easy because it's easily identifiable. I mean, it has a geographic location and
Exactly.
boundaries. Now, is HLC willing to work with the homeowners there and bring forward a recommendation to council? Because I think that's the only way probably to get an overlay zone proposal
Absolutely.
to us.
Right.
And I think that
was our
would be
recommendation
great.
even at our public comment period, that we said, it was driven by a project that was, had actually fallen through literally the cracks there.
Okay.
But as a further consideration, if the city council would support and the neighborhood is willing to actually go forward with that overlay, then to become part of the zoning
That would be a good first step
recommendation.
because that, as I say, it's so geographically intact and it easily identifiable.
Yes.
Two other questions. One is mid-century moderns.
Yes.
It's another area where in the Mackey homes, the Eichler homes, people are looking at similar things. The Mackey home is probably not as concise of an area, and it's got some edges and things that have been compromised, but are you doing any work on those? And then what about the review of homes that are 4 bedrooms or more, or 5 bedrooms or more, whatever it was, in order to prevent single-family homes from being designed as
Airbnb.
multi-tenant, well, no, not Airbnbs, multi-tenant housing. Boarding houses, if you want to call it that, but more than just boarding houses, multi-tenant housing when they're a single-family home.
So to speak to the latter thing, the HLC, we cannot resist the temptation to consider these broader zoning and compliance questions. And we often comment on it, but usually when we make a recommendation to council, it's about the historic context, the contribution there. Is it visible from the street? If not, then maybe we can't care, and we may note it. But we don't see it as our purview to enforce a perhaps hoped-for zoning policy, right? That's one thing. And if I may speak to a couple of other things.
Well, before you
This-
leave that one,
Sure.
because council had sent this to architectural review, and now we no longer even have a council member on architectural review, so we have no touch, we have no way of knowing what's happening at architectural review level. But that's where it came up, and I think it wasn't on Park Court, it may have been on Park Avenue that was a catalyst for this thing, when they were redesigning a home, rebuilding it, and it was like a dorm, mini dorms, if that's what you want to call it, and we were trying to get a way that we could make sure that these multi-bedroom houses were being designed in a way that still functioned as a single-family home. And we were being successful in that, but now that we don't have anyone on there, I don't know where that's gone or.
So I know Architecture Review has heard an argument something like this. I want to convert my 3-2 into a 5-6. And the reason is my children and I all think it's right that each of us should have a suite. It should consist of a bedroom, a sitting room, and a bathroom, right? And by the way, there will be a bar that's almost a kitchen in the other part of the house. And you get into and we intend to live here for a long time. But then if it goes through, you find it on the market 9 months later, right? So plainly, things are happening like that. If you want the HLC to consider that and put it in our report, I look at my fellow commissioners.
I think it should. I
We
mean,
might be
especially-
happy to do that.
Especially if it's in,
right?
it's either at a historic property or, within the zone of a historic property. Absolutely, we need to know, because we've been trying to prevent those mini dorms for
Yeah.
a long time now.
I would like to say something in general about the idea of a district, and that is the great potential for simplification. So we had this group of, 10 or 12 residents from Park Court here recently, and they were exceedingly, almost frighteningly well-informed, and their assertion that in the past, things had been enforced as though every one of those houses was regarded as historic had some heft to it, right? So they were surprised when one of the neighbors was able to strip the cladding off the house and go for something that was non-conforming, let's put it that way. Expectations, difficulties. I think the linearity of knowing I'm in a district, I know what to expect, I'm going to have to do shiplap siding, is a good thing, right?
Some of these things are in our historic preservation ordinance, so how do they get to that point to you through staff without getting some staff feedback as to what should be happening under our historic preservation
Well,
ordinance?
they may not be designated currently, they may not be within
Doesn't
the
matter if they're
radius of,
designated,
and that's the whole
thing.
point.
I know. 'Cause
So it used to be you could go to our, I think, no longer existent prior GIS system, put in an address, and it would come up and say, historic, sort of, right? But those were not necessarily designated properties. There was like somewhere in the city, we identified Park Court is like historic, okay? And then staff would sometimes say, you can't tear off the shiplap siding. But now it's happening, and the other neighbors are going, what's going on?
So do we need more
Right.
staff training? I mean, because it doesn't have to be a designated property. We went through all of this when we passed historic preservation ordinance to begin with. It doesn't even have, it doesn't have to, because first of all, our list is incomplete, and I don't know if it'll ever be completed. So you can't rely on that.
So in this instance, what happened, I believe, is because of our new historic preservation ordinance, which actually expanded the limits of within a historic resource.
Right.
It used to be 100 feet. Park Court was a total different anomaly in how it was enforced before. But today, it's 200 feet. And this property sits literally between another historic resource and it is not designated. So really, by the historic preservation ordinance, they can do whatever they want because it doesn't have that district overlay.
And I really want to emphasize that the staff is following the ordinance. We look at that property, we look at what the ordinance says, and we made a determination based on that it wasn't subject to the historic review. I think in the past, there was a more informal approach where without it being codified, staff would just probably proactively make a comment. But in this case, we are now that the city has adopted an ordinance, we're following what the ordinance actually says about it.
Because you can legally enforce it. The zoning ordinance would basically limit
And if the
us.
property itself is not historic, not that it's designated or not, if it doesn't meet the other criteria of being historic, then yes, you're right. But it still has to be noticed if it affects a historic resource, and you do have some control over saying you're not going to put, a two-story stucco apartment building next to this Queen Anne Victorian like they used to, because I live next door to one. So in that regard, I mean, we do have some controls. But yes, if it's a single-family home and it was built in the 60s because it infilled between two Victorians, okay. But what I'm saying is designation is not the standard for review if it meets historic criteria. And that's what we have to be aware of. It doesn't have to be on our list because our list is incomplete.
Thank you, Councilmember Chahal.
So I go back a few years when I was a member of a Historic Preservation Ordinance Committee, actually, and this topic of having districts was discussed in detail during that committee deliberations. And it was shut down because of various reasons, because of the smaller size of the city and all that stuff. But we need to make sure that our single-family design guidelines and historical preservation ordinance they need to come up with something where we can protect these assets down the line. And that's what need to do, basically. Our single-family guidelines are really vague guidelines. I think we are working on to improve those. And if we can incorporate those preservation aspects on those single-family guidelines, that might help supplement preservation of these things. Yeah, unless until we go back to a committee and change our historic preservation ordinance and make a district or find out something where we find out some more Mackey district or other districts, that's a different issue. But for the time being, we can have a stopgap arrangement where we can work on these things.
If you want to, we don't have much more time. I want to make sure we get other topics and other things as well. Anna.
There's a few things that I agree with here. I like the idea of the district, because it's almost like a big brother kind of effect on the neighborhood. And when we saw all those people come from Park Court, they were protective of their neighborhood. The one guy who was there who caused all the chaos, they were upset with them. Not in an angry way, but they wanted justice. They wanted it
Anna, can
straightened
you
out.
speak in the microphone? Thank
Sure.
you.
So I think there's an advantage to having districts, several advantages, actually. It could help with our heritage tourism. I mean, when I lived in Pasadena, there were wonderful neighborhoods there. The bungalow heaven neighborhoods, I mean, people wanted to drive through them, and the neighbors were very proud of their neighborhood. I mean, it added value to the city, so I think we could benefit from that. It helps our limited resources by having these neighborhoods take care of their own neighborhoods, you know, and report problems like these people did. So there are tremendous benefits to considering districts for our small city.
Okay, great.
My turn.
Yes.
It's always my
Give
turn.
them a microphone. All right, Spike.
First of all, I'd like to congratulate all the new members of the council to have the new blue blood and.
Can you
Matt-
speak?
and
We
Matt-
want to
and
hear
Madam
you.
Mayor is-
We want to hear you.
Congratulations
Yes,
on being
thank you.
elected to me, and all that stuff. What I would like to add to this discussion is that if you look at the inventory of all the homes, most of the homes, probably 99% of them, they qualify by the Department of Interior standards as historical because they're 50 years old. And you have to start there because what I think about is that my house was built in 1946. What's going to happen in 2046 when somebody looks at it and they come to the city and they say, oh, how do we handle this? And I mean, and on and on and on. It's something that this group should be, obviously Park Court is I'm very familiar with Park Court area, but you got to realize that obviously behind on Park Avenue, between Park and the Alameda, is just as historical because it was built about the same time. And actually, the house in the corner of Hillmar and Park, C.C. Walker's house, was built by the first contractor in Santa Clara, Pete Becerra. So, I mean, we're talking in the 40s here, folks, you know, and that's my concern is the people behind us, and we don't want to get in a situation that this nice young lady is getting involved in rebuilding a downtown and wondering why in the hell do those people do what they did when they did it? And that is the key. We've got to be ahead of the curve instead of behind it. Obviously, these homes over here, there's no issue. 1800s and all that other stuff. But, I mean, that's my concern. These nice people know all the ins and outs and all that stuff. And I just hope that we just don't get overwhelmed with new, and leave the rest out of this thing. And come to some conclusion of who and what we are. We are Santa Clara, a unique city in the peninsula. And as I'll close with a little thought that I have from one of our former mayors, God bless Eddie. He says, remember folks, they're not all prune pickers down there, dumb prune pickers down there. And that's what we have to establish, that we have smart ideas and smart ways of approaching this, because these houses are going to get older I mean, you're all gonna be gone. I'm gonna be gone. So what's this people behind us do? And thank you. I mean, I don't have anything else. I mean, yeah, that's enough.
So I kind of want to add a little bit to it. So I think this, based on the concerns Spike has, like that's where some of the district and actually having a historic context statement would really help. So we can really identify what really truly has historical significance and what doesn't, like regardless of age. So we can actually have something codified. Like as somebody who inherited a Mills Act contract, it's nerve-wracking because I don't know what I'm looking at, like when I bought the house. So, you know, having the more of the education bit, more something in the contract that's very clear on what's being enforced, having a district and design guidelines and leeway of changing things. One of the houses that we talked about with the ADU is right next door to me. And they're on the Mills Act, their ADU, it's not conforming to the design guidelines that are out there. But we really highly encourage them to build the unit because, you know, having a unit is great, but like there's not enough flexibility in the guidelines for them to do the things. So, you know, I love the efforts that Rena is doing right now with helping us doing a overlay for the what was it? Yeah, well, like just in different coding in general, and that's been very helpful. But I think, and I've actually talked to some of the neighbors like over at Park Court since we've met at the HLC, and you know, it's a lot of education that it's not out there, a lot of information that's not out there for them.
I do really want to jump in, though, and say something where I disagree with Spike, you know, and that is, we'll be like deer in the headlamps if we think everything 50 years old is significant. It's simply not, okay? Being 50 years old as a structure or whatever does not make it historically significant, nor is it a bar that must be crossed. There are things that are historically significant. If John F. Kennedy slept here and it's 45 years ago or whatever, it's more than that, but it would be potentially significant, right? So we can't say every ranch house in Santa Clara or every minimalist house or whatever is historically significant. That's just not the way it works.
Thanks. Michael, would you like to say something on any topic?
Sure. I've really enjoyed my time on the commission so far. I think Patricia is doing a lot of terrific work that she didn't particularly talk about, but she's doing this This Place Matters campaign to get people, Stephen is working on that as well, or you're just being modest? Okay, well, and so, because one of the things that I thought would be great is to give the people that live in these neighborhoods who have so much pride about their historic homes the opportunity to, you know, display that pride and talk about what's special about their neighborhood on the website. And so Patricia and I guess the other commissioners have been working on this Place Matters campaign to where people can send in photos of their home and talk about why it's historic, why it's significant, and, you know, the work that they've done on it. And they're having a barbecue too.
There's a lot of different neighborhood things that we're doing. We're trying to raise awareness. But Priya did bring up the Displays Matter campaign.
Okay.
There's a photo contest involved and stuff. And we actually tried to do an iteration of it last year. And I think we maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I would like to echo, you know, the idea of creating a district overlay. I think that is a good idea. And it sounds like that's a doable thing for at least the Park Court neighborhood. I do, though, you know, have some concerns, I guess, about how that would affect people maybe that aren't interested in historic preservation. And I know our whole point is to promote historic preservation, but I'm just looking at the other side of that, you know, potential impact on the people in those neighborhoods. And also regarding the Mills contracts in terms of, I don't know how they were necessarily enforced before, but if it sounds like they're going to, you know, they're going to enforce like a 5-year audit. But I was wondering, for the things in the contract, let's say there's 10 items, if the foundation crumbles and they have to repair the foundation, and that is as expensive as all 10 items on the list, then is that assessed at the end of the 10-year period unless there's an unannounced audit? So I'm just wondering, were these, and I can, follow up with my commission members, but in general, just how we're following up on these contracts, if it's a yearly update, and how we're determining what work is done based on the cost of the work or just the number of items, done that were on a list. But on a personal note, I enjoy the meetings the most when the public comes to the meetings. And so that's what I think we should try to do more of, is engage the public. It sounds like, for example, Patricia inherited a Mills Act contract, and she didn't really know what that meant or what, the ramifications are on the modifications or improvements she could or could not make to her home. So I think just moving forward, looking towards the future, giving the people in those neighborhoods the recognition and the opportunity to, show their pride and talk about their neighborhood, give them ownership of it. They own the homes, I want it to be less in the hands of us and more in the hands of the people who actually live in those neighborhoods. And it sounds like, we're kind of working on a lot of things over here to make that happen. So I just want to say thank you very much, and I look forward to our continued collaboration.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments.
If I may, I just want to add on, there's been a couple references to the zoning code update. We have been discussing through the outreach for that, the idea of overlay districts, also how to deal with boarding houses and architectural review process. And we have study sessions coming up with the city council where we'll present what we've heard and have opportunity for the council to discuss that as well.
Okay, I just want to ask fellow council members for their comments. I want to make one comment first, is that we own a grand home in Santa Clara, which is the Morse Mansion. Eventually, in the next few years, I don't know how many are left.
7.
Is it 7, 6, 5? Didn't think it was that many. We'll be getting that home back. And it's never too early to start talking about and thinking about, what we would like to do with that city treasure. So you would be the absolute best commission to start really talking about that seriously, and we'll determine how many years are left. I should have asked that ahead of time, I'm sorry. But we do have maybe a handful of years left on that. So, council members?
I want the fence put around the Morse Mansion. You got it. That's the first thing, and I want the carriage house put back in the back.
Well,
I got a few ideas.
your microphone's not on, so we didn't hear any of that. We didn't hear any of that.
It would
So
make,
it's not legal.
it would make a
press the
splendid
green.
headquarters for the HLC.
That would be, okay. Yes, put that on the
That's an
list.
idea already.
Councilmember O'Neill.
Okay, so I want to thank everybody for all the work you're doing. And one, and I think most people know that I've been a big proponent for a long time of doing the zoning code update. And in terms of the overlays, I think that there's different things to look at. Say, like, if you've got something like the Park Court where there's like a style that all of the homes originally had, that's, or even that one block of Harrison Street that had all the original houses. But one of the things that I try to point out to folks is that I think part of what's interesting about the old quad is that the houses don't all look exactly alike. So I think that there has to be some differentiation between something where there is some value in trying to enforce a common design standard, as opposed to having something that, a more general historic district, which tries to, kind of keep the houses in character with a certain period of time, and they're not all the same. And I know we've had some very spirited discussions about the Mackey homes, and that's one of the areas, like, there's that has probably caused more controversy than in terms of architecture than anything in the city, because some people, and I know Mr. Estes is one of them, that treasure the architecture there, and I find it very interesting, but others don't like it. So like one of the things I've thought about, could you have a small group like we've talked about, like Hayes? There's a block of Hayes that most of the houses are almost completely intact. Would those neighbors be willing to go together to try to form a district or something? Because at this point, because of how you mentioned that, for a long time, there's been all kinds of changes and things like that, to look at some alternative ways to look at the historic preservation, and I'm not sure where we are, but we do have, you know, some issues have been raised about, say, like the Eichler Townhome, you know, the Pomeroy Green and Pomeroy West. And to look at, so to maybe look at overlays in a little bit different way and thinking we you know, might need to customize that a little bit.
I had one comment. When they call you hysterical historicals, just smile and own it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for putting this together also. Your accomplishments are incredible as a commission. And I also wanted to end by saying, whatever you do in terms of, you know, your social campaigns and other things, make sure you're working with our communications department here in the city so that we can help promote what you're doing as a city, because I think it's pretty awesome what you're doing. Yes.
But yeah, we're definitely working through the library with our librarian, with Justin, so that's been amazing working with him.
Yes, and even through our city manager's office to do that, so, you know, we can get the word out through all of our, you know, our social media and other, you know, ways to get information out so that the city can enjoy what you're doing, because there's a huge pride in our history here in Santa Clara. That's all we talk about all day long is our history here and how proud we are. So thank you so much for your service, all of you, and the plan, and for meeting us this evening.
Thank you again, City
Thank you.
Council.
And go get